October 25th, 1944 dawned with deceptive calm over the Philippine Sea, the kind of stillness that precedes catastrophe. Ensign Robert Hagen stood on the deck of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort so small that sailors jokingly called her a tin can, a vessel measuring just 306 feet long with walls so thin a determined man could punch through them. The ship displaced a mere 1,450 tons, making her one of the smallest combat vessels in the United States Navy. Hagen watched the horizon, unaware that within hours, he and his shipmates would face the most powerful battleship ever constructed by human hands, the Yamato, a floating fortress weighing 72,800 tons, armed with 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of a Volkswagen Beetle over 26 miles. The Samuel B. Roberts belonged to Taffy 3, a small escort carrier group shepherding 6 escort carriers and their destroyer screen off the coast of Samar Island. Their mission was mundane: provide air support for General Douglas MacArthur's landing forces retaking the Philippines. The crew of 413 men had trained for convoy duty in submarine hunting, not surface combat against capital ships. Commander Robert Copeland, the ship's 37-year-old captain, maintained strict discipline but possessed a fatherly concern for his young crew. Most were barely out of high school, Midwestern farm boys and city kids who had never imagined they would face the Imperial Japanese Navy's greatest weapons. Unknown to Taffy 3, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force has survived the gauntlet of American air attacks. In the Sibian Sea the previous day, his fleet included the Yamato. Her sister ship Musashi had already been sunk for battleships, 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers, a concentrated striking force designed to annihilate the American landing forces. Kurita had navigated through San Bernardino Strait during the night, exploiting a catastrophic intelligence failure. Admiral William Halsey had taken his powerful Third Fleet north, chasing the Japanese decoy force, leaving the landing beaches protected only by Taffy 3's thin-skinned escort carriers and their destroyer escorts. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, published between 1947 and 1962, the ensuing battle off Samar would become one of the most gallant naval actions in American history. At 06:45 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe base spotted pagoda-style masts on the northern horizon. Within minutes, massive geysers of colored water, purple, red, green, and yellow dye markers used by Japanese ships to spot their salvos, erupted around the escort carriers. The kaleidoscope of death marching toward them meant one thing: the Japanese had found them. Commander Copeland grabbed the ship's intercom. His voice crackled through every compartment. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Below decks, gunners made 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr rush to his station at Gun Mount 2, the aft 5-inch gun. The 24-year-old from Checotah, Oklahoma had maintained his weapon with obsessive care, ensuring every mechanism operated flawlessly. Carr understood mathematics. The calculus of their situation was brutal. Their 5-inch guns had an effective range of 10 miles. Yamato's 18-inch rifles could strike from 26 miles away. Torpedoman Jack Hewson descended into the ship's magazine, where Mark 15 torpedoes rested in their tubes. Each torpedo weighed 3,200 pounds and carried 825 pounds of Torpex explosive. Against Yamato's 16-inch armor belt, they were pins against an elephant. But pins could still draw blood if aimed precisely. Hewson had joined the Navy to escape poverty in Depression-era Pennsylvania. Now he prepared weapons that might buy a few more minutes of life. Radio Man 2nd Class Tullio Serafini monitored communications as Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, broadcast desperate pleas for assistance. The nearest American heavy ships were hours away. Sprague ordered his escort carriers to launch every available aircraft, even those armed only with practice bombs or depth charges meant for submarines. Then he commanded his 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts to do the impossible: charge directly at Kurita's battleships and buy time with their lives. The Samuel B. Roberts increased speed to 28 knots, black smoke pouring from her stacks as engineering pushed the boilers beyond safety limits. The mathematics of courage are simple but merciless. The Yamato displaced 51 times more tonnage than the Samuel B. Roberts. Her armor belt measured 16 inches thick, nearly half the diameter of the entire hull of the destroyer escort at the waterline. Her main battery guns weighed as much as 4 entire destroyer escorts. Each shell from those massive rifles contained nearly 3,000 pounds of explosives, more than all the torpedoes aboard the Roberts combined. Yet Commander Copeland ordered flank speed directly toward this floating fortress, and 413 men obeyed without hesitation. Seaman First Class William Burton scrambled across the deck toward his damage control station. As Japanese shells began finding their range, the first near miss lifted the Roberts bodily from the water, the concussion rattling teeth and stopping hearts for a terrifying instant. Burton had celebrated his 19th birthday 3 days earlier. His mother in Duluth, Minnesota, had sent a care package that arrived late. It would be returned to her with a folded flag. The destroyer escort weaved through a forest of shell splashes, each colored fountain marking where a 14-inch or 16-inch shell from Kurita's battleships had struck the sea. The Japanese had divided their fire, with Yamato and her consorts targeting the fleeing escort carriers, while the heavy cruisers Haguro, Tone, and Chikuma engaged the charging American destroyers. The Roberts benefited momentarily from this divided attention, but Copeland knew their luck would evaporate once they closed to torpedo range. Lieutenant Robert Roberts, no relation to the ship's namesake, commanded the forward gun mount. His crew had achieved the highest gunnery scores in their training group, and now they would test their skills against targets that should have been impossible. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun could fire 15 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Roberts' crew exceeded that, hammering out shells in a continuous rhythm that made the deck plates vibrate. They aimed not at the distant battleships, but at the closer heavy cruisers, hoping to distract or damage the thinner-skinned vessels. At 0720 hours, the Roberts reached torpedo range. Copeland ordered the tubes fired in a spread pattern aimed at the cruiser column. Usen and his team launched all 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, their compressed air ejection system hissing as 2 tons of steel and explosive entered the water with barely a splash. The torpedoes accelerated to 46 knots, their contra-rotating propellers driving them toward targets 9,000 yards distant. The crew held its breath. A hit on a heavy cruiser could cripple or even sink it, validating their suicidal charge. 270 seconds after launch, a massive explosion erupted along the side of the heavy cruiser Chikai. Usen's torpedo had struck home, detonating beneath the cruiser's engineering spaces. Chikai lurched violently to port, black smoke pouring from her ruptured hull. The cruiser slowed, falling out of formation, mortally wounded. She would be scuttled by Japanese destroyers later that day. One tiny destroyer escort had eliminated a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser from the battle. The crew of the Roberts erupted in cheers that died quickly as reality reasserted itself. Having expended their torpedoes, the Roberts now possessed only her 5-inch guns against the Imperial Japanese Navy's assembled might. Copeland did not order retreat. Instead, he positioned his ship to continue engaging, using smokescreens laid by other American destroyers to mask their movements. The Roberts became a ghost, appearing from clouds of smoke to fire a few salvos before disappearing again. A mosquito harassing giants. Paul Carr's gun mount settled into a deadly rhythm. Load, aim, fire, repeat. The barrel grew so hot that paint blistered and peeled from the metal. Carr directed his crew with calm precision, adjusting for range in the ship's erratic maneuvering. Each shell traced an arc toward the Japanese formation. Most missed, raising harmless splashes, but some found their targets. A hit on the battleship Congo's superstructure killed several crew members and damaged fire control equipment. Another penetrated the light armor of the cruiser Suzuya, starting fires below decks. The Japanese had initially dismissed the destroyer escorts as insignificant, but the relentless American attacks forced Kurita to maneuver his battleships defensively, reducing their speed and disrupting their pursuit of the escort carriers. The admiral, traumatized by his losses in the Sibian Sea and confused by the ferocity of American resistance, began to doubt his intelligence. Perhaps he faced not escort carriers, but fleet carriers, not destroyer escorts, but heavy cruisers. The smoke and chaos of battle bred uncertainty in his mind. At 0810 hours, the Roberts' luck expired. The first shell that struck the Samuel B. Roberts came from the heavy cruiser Chikuma at 0810 hours precisely, though time would become meaningless in the hell that followed. The 14-inch projectile penetrated the thin hull plating on the port side aft, passing completely through the ship before exploding in the water beyond. The delayed fuse likely saved dozens of lives. Had it detonated inside the hull, the Roberts would have disintegrated instantly. Instead, the shell's passage created 2 ragged holes, each large enough to drive a jeep through, and the sea began flooding into the aft engine room. Chief Machinist Mate Harold Bolliner led the engineering crew in a desperate battle against physics itself. Water poured into the compartment at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. The Pacific Ocean, seeking to reclaim the space humans had temporarily borrowed. Balliner and his men worked the pumps while simultaneously maintaining steam pressure to keep the ship mobile. They knew the mathematics: lose propulsion, become a stationary target, die. The choice was simple even if the execution was not. The second hit arrived 30 seconds later, another 14-inch shell from Chikuma. This one struck forward, demolishing the crew's berthing area. 14 men died instantly, their bodies simply ceasing to exist as steel and explosive rewrote the laws of anatomy. The blast hurled Seaman Burton 15 feet through the air, slamming him against a bulkhead with force that fractured his ribs. He rose anyway, staggering toward his damaged control station even as blood filled one lung. Burton and his team dragged fire hoses toward flames that reached 20 feet high, the rubber lines writhing in their hands like serpents. Commander Copeland conned the ship from the open bridge, refusing to take shelter despite shells screaming overhead with sounds like freight trains. He needed visibility to maneuver, and the thin walls of the bridge offered no real protection anyway. A destroyer escort's bridge could be penetrated by heavy machine gun fire. A 14-inch shell would pass through it like tissue paper. Copeland watched his ship die by degrees while simultaneously directing her final battle, a conductor leading an orchestra into oblivion. The third shell struck at 0815, a direct hit on the forward engine room. The explosion ruptured steam lines, releasing superheated vapor at 650 degrees Fahrenheit. Men died screaming, their lungs seared by steam that cooked them from the inside. Lieutenant Lloyd Garnett, commanding the forward engineering spaces, sealed the compartment to prevent the steam from spreading, knowingly trapping his men inside. 12 sailors perished in that steel coffin so that the ship might continue fighting for a few more minutes. The Roberts slowed to 17 knots, then 12, then 8. She was dying, but her guns continued firing. Lieutenant Roberts' forward mount maintained its cadence despite fires raging nearby and the deck tilting beneath the crew's feet. They served the gun with mechanical precision, the training that had been drilled into them overriding the animal instinct to flee. Shells slammed into the Japanese formation at a rate that seemed impossible from a sinking ship. The crew knew they were dead men. That knowledge liberated them from fear. In the aft gun mount, Paul Carr directed fire with the concentration of a master craftsman. His mount had fired over 600 rounds, triple the normal sustainable rate. The barrel glowed cherry red even in daylight. The loading mechanism, designed for sustained fire of 10 rounds per minute, operated beyond its engineering specifications through Carr's maintenance and his crew's skill. They had become a single organism, human and machine merged through shared purpose. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. At 0827, a fourth shell struck the Roberts' aft section. This one detonated inside the hull, directly beneath gun mount 2. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast wave propagated upward, carrying with it shrapnel, fire, and destruction. The gun mount's ready ammunition exploded in a secondary blast that killed or wounded the entire crew. Paul Carr's body was hurled against the gun's breech block, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. Around him, his gunmates lay dead or dying, the precisely choreographed team reduced to scattered bodies. The ship listed heavily to port now, water pouring into multiple wounds below the waterline. Fire spread through the superstructure, consuming everything flammable. The Roberts had perhaps 10 minutes of life remaining. Admiral Sprague, monitoring the battle from his flagship, watched through binoculars as the tiny destroyer escort continued to fight despite being visibly on fire and sinking. He would later write in his action report, "The courage and fighting spirit of the officers and men were beyond belief." Commander Copeland made his way aft through smoke and flames to assess damage. Commander Copeland arrived at gun mount 2 through a landscape transformed into hell's antechamber. Flames roared from ruptured fill lines, painting the gray paint black with soot and ash. The deck, twisted by explosions, rose at unnatural angles that made walking a treacherous proposition. Bodies lay where the blast had left them, some intact, others not. Copeland had commanded men in battle before, but nothing had prepared him for this, the complete disintegration of his ship while she still floated and fought. What he found at gun mount 2 would haunt him for the remaining 40 years of his life. The gun itself remained operational despite the carnage surrounding it. The mount's armored shield had absorbed some of the blast, protecting the gun mechanism while failing to protect the men who served it. 5 sailors lay dead around the weapon, their bodies testament to the violence of modern naval warfare. The 6th member of the gun crew still lived, though Copeland initially struggled to understand how. Paul Henry Carr lay against the breech block, his body catastrophically damaged. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, and his intestines were visible through the wound. Blood pooled beneath him, more blood than Copeland thought a human body could lose and still maintain consciousness. Yet Carr's eyes remained focused, alert, fixed on the task before him with an intensity that transcended physical agony. His hands, slick with his own blood, worked the gun's loading mechanism, attempting to chamber a 54-pound shell into the breech. "Sir," Carr said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the mortal wound, "I need help loading this round." Copeland knelt beside the dying gunner, medic training warring with command necessity. Carr needed immediate evacuation to whatever medical facilities remained functional aboard the sinking ship, but the gun mount represented the Roberts' last meaningful offensive capability. The forward gun had fallen silent, its crew killed when a shell penetrated the magazine. Only Carr's weapon could still engage the enemy, and Carr refused to abandon it despite wounds that would have incapacitated men of lesser determination. "Carr, you're badly wounded," Copeland said, signaling for corpsmen. "We need to get you medical attention." "The gun's still good, sir," Carr insisted, his bloodied hands still working the loading mechanism. "Just need more men and we can keep firing. The Japs are still out there." The absurdity of the statement, that two additional crew members could somehow maintain the rate of fire Carr's highly trained team had achieved, seemed lost on the dying gunner. His world had contracted to the dimensions of the gun mount, to the mechanical sequence of loading, aiming, firing. Everything else, including his own mortality, had become irrelevant background noise to the essential task of sending shells toward the enemy. Lieutenant Henry Bowers, the ship's gunnery officer, arrived with 2 sailors willing to help Carr continue firing. The volunteers understood the futility. The Roberts was clearly sinking, listing further to port with each minute, her speed now barely 4 knots. Continuing to fight would not save the ship or their lives. But 413 men had charged a fleet of battleships that morning. Mathematics and survival instincts subordinated to duty and defiance. 2 more sailors operating a doomed gun fit perfectly within that logic. Carr directed them with quiet authority, his voice never rising despite the agony he must have been experiencing. "Load the shell into the hoist. Elevate the hoist. Ram the shell home. Insert the powder charge. Close the breech. Aim using the manual sights since fire control had been destroyed. Fire." The process that had taken Carr's trained crew 6 seconds now consumed 20. But the gun still fired. A shell arced toward the Japanese formation, followed by another, then another. At 08:33 hours, the loading hoist jammed. A piece of shrapnel, driven into the mechanism by the earlier explosion, had lodged in the gears. Carr refused to accept this mechanical failure as the end. With corpsmen desperately trying to stabilize his wounds, he used his remaining strength to manually force the hoist mechanism, trying to free the jammed gear through sheer willpower. His hands left bloody prints on the metal as he worked. "The gun's good, sir," he repeated to Lieutenant Bowers, the words becoming a mantra. "The gun's still good." But the Roberts herself was not good. A 5th shell from the heavy cruiser Haguro struck the ship's forward section at 08:35, detonating in the magazine that served the already silenced forward gun. The explosion lifted the bow completely out of the water, and when it crashed back down, the entire forward structure was ablaze. Water now flooded multiple compartments below decks. Chief Balliner reported from engineering that the pumps could no longer keep pace with the flooding, and steam pressure was failing as fires reached the boiler rooms. The ship had minutes, not hours, left. Commander Copeland made the decision no captain ever wants to make. At 09:05 hours, he ordered abandon ship. The crew began methodically following their training, inflating life rafts, securing the wounded, donning life jackets. Many had no life jackets. The ready lockers had been destroyed in the shelling. Men grabbed whatever would float, including empty shell casings and wooden debris. Paul Carr refused to leave his gun mount. 3 corpsmen surrounded Paul Carr in the ruins of Gun Mount 2, trying to convince the dying gunner to release his grip on the gun's loading mechanism. Chief Pharmacist Mate James Cockrell had served aboard destroyers throughout the Pacific campaign, treating wounds from the Solomons to the Philippines. But he had never encountered a man so severely injured who remained not just conscious, but actively fighting to continue his duties. Carr's abdominal wound had bled through every bandage Cockrell applied. The gunner's skin had gone the pale gray color that preceded death, yet his eyes remained focused on the jammed hoist mechanism with an engineer's analytical intensity. "Carr, the captain's ordered abandon ship," Cockrell said, his voice gentle but firm. "The ship's going down. We need to get you to a life raft." "Not until the gun's operational," Carr replied, his voice weakened but determined. His bloodied hands continued working the jammed mechanism, fingers slipping on metal made slick by his own blood. Just need to clear this jam. 2 more minutes. The absurdity of the statement was evident to everyone except Carr himself. The Roberts wallowed in the water, listing 30 degrees to port, fires consuming her superstructure, her back broken by multiple shell hits. Even if Carr miraculously repaired the gun, the ship would sink before it could fire another salvo. Yet the gunner seemed unable or unwilling to process this reality, his entire being focused on the mechanical problem before him with the same intensity he had brought to gun maintenance during peaceful watches. Lieutenant Bowers knelt beside Carr, placing a hand on the gunner's shoulder. Paul, you've done your job. You've done more than anyone could ask. The gun's yours to the end, but you need medical attention now. Carr turned toward Bowers, and for a moment, clarity seemed to break through the shock and determination that had sustained him. Tears cut clean lines through the soot and blood on his face. Sir, I can still serve this gun. I know I can. Just help me clear this jam. Around them, the Samuel B. Roberts was dying in stages. Forward, flames had reached the bridge, forcing surviving crew members to flee to the aft sections. Midships, the list had grown so severe that men struggled to maintain footing on the tilting deck. Below decks, the engineering spaces had flooded completely, drowning the compartments where Chief Balliner and his team had fought their impossible battle against the sea. The water temperature was 84 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that men could survive for hours once in the water, assuming they avoided Japanese guns and the sharks that patrolled these waters. Commander Copeland appeared at the gun mount one final time, the captain making a last circuit of his dying ship to ensure all hands were evacuating. He found Carr still working the jam mechanism, 3 corpsmen hovering nearby with a stretcher, unwilling to forcibly remove a wounded man from his duty station, but knowing he would die if they did not. Gunners make Carr, Copeland said, using the formal rank to penetrate the fog surrounding the dying man. I am ordering you to abandon your post. We're leaving the ship now. Carr's hand stilled on the mechanism. His eyes met Copeland's, and for a moment, the captain saw complete understanding there, not just of the order, but of everything it implied. The battle was ending. The Roberts had bought the time Admiral Sprague needed. Taffy 3's escort carriers were opening their range, helped by the desperate attacks of the destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Japanese, confused and bloodied, were withdrawing. The sacrifice had meaning. Carr could let go. Sir, Carr whispered. Then, softer, is the gun salvageable? For the next ship. Copeland looked at the blood-soaked weapon, its barrel warped from overheating, its hoist mechanism jammed, mounted on a ship that would rest on the bottom of the Philippine Sea within 20 minutes. Yes, Carr, the gun will be salvaged. The lie was mercy, and Carr accepted it as truth. He released his grip on the loading mechanism, his bloody hands finally still. The corpsman lifted him onto the stretcher with exquisite gentleness, trying to minimize the agony that simple movement caused. Carr made no sound, his jaw clenched against pain that must have been overwhelming. They carried him across the tilting deck toward the rail, where life rafts waited. Other wounded men already occupied the rafts, sailors with burns and shrapnel wounds and broken bones from the 2 hours of combat. The able-bodied crew members went into the water directly, forming chains to help move the wounded into the rafts. The Japanese had ceased firing, either because they had lost sight of the Roberts in the smoke and chaos or because even they recognized the battle's conclusion. Small mercies in a merciless morning. As the corpsmen prepared to lower Carr into a life raft, the Roberts shuddered violently. A bulkhead belowdecks had failed, allowing water to flood into compartments that had remained dry. The list increased dramatically, reaching 45 degrees. Men slid across the deck, grabbing for handholds. Equipment broke free from damaged fittings, tumbling into the sea. The ship was entering her final moments. The structural integrity that had kept her afloat, despite impossible damage, finally surrendering to physics and seawater. Get him in the raft now, Cockrell ordered. They lowered Carr's stretcher the final few feet. The life raft bobbed in water stained with oil and debris, a small island of orange rubber in a gray sea. Paul Henry Carr died as they settled him into the raft, his eyes open and fixed on the gun mount he had served until consciousness finally failed him. The Samuel B. Roberts slipped beneath the Philippine Sea at 09:35 hours on October 25, 1944. She went down bow first, her stern rising nearly vertical as water filled the forward compartments completely. Commander Copeland, the last man to leave the ship, watched from a life raft 100 yards distant as his command disappeared into the depths. The stern hung in the air for what seemed an eternity, but was likely only 30 seconds, long enough for men to read the ship's name painted in white letters across the transom. Then she was gone, leaving only bubbles and debris to mark where she had been. The survivors floated in clusters, life rafts surrounded by men treading water or clinging to anything buoyant. Some groups sang hymns or patriotic songs to maintain morale. Others maintained silence, too exhausted or traumatized to speak. The water temperature remained warm, but many men had been burned or wounded, and salt water in open wounds brought agony that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. Pharmacists made Cockrell move between rafts, doing what he could with depleted medical supplies, prioritizing the wounded who might survive versus those too gravely injured to save. Seaman William Burton floated with fractured ribs. That made each breath an exercise in controlled agony. He had helped launch 3 life rafts before abandoning ship himself, working despite his injuries because the alternative was watching wounded shipmates drown. Now he clung to a piece of wooden decking, his life jacket having been destroyed when the shell struck his damaged control station. Around him, other sailors in similar circumstances formed a chain, linking arms to conserve energy and maintain group cohesion. Survival at sea was a communal effort. Men alone died while groups survived. The Japanese fleet had withdrawn to the north, Admiral Kurita having concluded at 0930 that he faced not escort carriers, but fleet carriers, not a support group, but a major task force. The ferocious American resistance, the aircraft attacks, the destroyer charges, all had convinced him he was outnumbered and outpositioned. In reality, he possessed overwhelming superiority in firepower and had been on the verge of massacring the escort carriers when confusion and doubt caused him to withdraw. Historians would debate his decision for decades, but in the moment, it saved thousands of American lives, including those of the Roberts survivors. Aircraft from the escort carriers began circling overhead at 1000 hours, providing air cover and marking the survivors' positions for rescue ships. Lieutenant Roberts, senior surviving officer after Commander Copeland, organized the life rafts into a coherent group that would be easier for rescuers to spot. He counted heads methodically, checking each raft's complement against his mental roster of the crew. The arithmetic was grim. Of 413 men aboard the Roberts that morning, 90 had died during the battle or gone down with the ship. Another 30 were gravely wounded and might not survive the hours until rescue arrived. The body of Paul Carr lay in one of the life rafts, treated with the same reverence afforded all the dead. His shipmates had closed his eyes and arranged his body as respectfully as circumstances allowed. The blood-stained hands that had refused to abandon their gun were folded across his chest. Men who had served with Carr told stories about him to the newer crew members, who had not known him well. His meticulous maintenance routines, his quiet competence, his Oklahoma drawl that became more pronounced when he was excited or angry. The stories transformed him from a corpse in a life raft to a person remembered, ensuring that when the Navy Department casualty report listed Carr, Paul Henry, GM3C, KIA in stark bureaucratic prose, some men would remember the human being behind the service number. At 1300 hours, the destroyer escort Dennis approached the survivors. Her crew had been searching for Robert's survivors since the battle ended, navigating through debris fields from multiple sunken ships. The Dennis's crew worked with desperate efficiency, hauling exhausted men from the water, treating the wounded, and recovering the dead with appropriate ceremony. Commander Copeland was the last survivor to board, maintaining the tradition that a captain leaves his ship last even when that ship has ceased to exist. The Dennis's commanding officer met Copeland as he came aboard. Saluting despite both men being soaked in seawater and oil, your crew fought magnificently. Commander, the entire fleet is talking about what you did. Copeland, too exhausted for diplomacy or false modesty, simply nodded. They were good men. They did their duty. Below decks, the Dennis's medical officer triads the wounded with the cold calculus that military medicine demands. Critical cases received immediate attention. Those who would likely survive without intervention waited. Those beyond help received morphine and comfort in their final hours. Seaman Burton, his fractured ribs immobilizing one lung, fell into the second category. He would survive to see the war's end and return to Duluth, where nightmares would wake him for decades whenever he dreamed of tilting decks and colored shell splashes. The bodies of the dead, including Paul Carr, were wrapped in canvas and prepared for burial at sea. The Dennis did not have facilities to refrigerate casualties, and the tropical heat demanded prompt action. The Dennis conducted burial services at 1700 hours on October 25, 1944, as the Philippine Sea darkened from blue to purple in the fading light. Commander Copeland read from the Navy's standard burial liturgy, his voice steady despite grief and exhaustion. 90 canvas-wrapped bodies lay in ranks on the destroyer escort's fantail, each weighted with shells to ensure they would sink rapidly. The crew of the Dennis stood at attention alongside survivors from the Roberts, salt-stained uniforms moving in the tropical breeze. When Copeland reached Paul Carr's name in the casualty list, his voice caught momentarily before recovering. Gunners Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, age 24, Checotah, Oklahoma. The words were an insufficient epitaph for a man who had served his gun, while his intestines spilled from his body. But the Navy ceremony allowed for nothing more elaborate. One by one, the canvas bundles slid into the sea, disappearing into depths that would hold them forever. The survivors slept that night aboard the Dennis, as she sailed from Manus Island in the Admiralty Islands, where the wounded would receive proper medical care and the able-bodied would await reassignment. Few slept well. Men cried out in nightmares, reliving the moment shells struck or compartments flooded or shipmates died. Seaman Burton lay awake in a crowded berthing space, his fractured ribs making sleep impossible even had his mind been quiet. He stared at the overhead pipes and electrical conduits, thinking about the men who would never see another dawn. The battle off Samar concluded with the Japanese in full retreat, and the American landing forces secure, though at devastating cost. Taffy 3 had lost the escort carriers to destroyers and one destroyer escort, the Roberts. Over 1,000 American sailors had died, but they had stopped a fleet that should have massacred every ship in the group. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers to the combined attacks of aircraft and surface ships, while several other vessels suffered severe damage. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw, influenced by the ferocious American resistance that made him believe he faced a much larger force, represented one of the war's pivotal moments. Had he pressed his attack, the entire Philippine invasion could have been jeopardized. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received after-action reports from Taffy 3 within 48 hours. Reading Commander Copeland's account of the Roberts' final action, Nimitz reportedly stated, "This will go down as one of the most courageous acts in naval history." The admiral directed that every surviving member of the Roberts crew be recognized, though the mechanisms of military bureaucracy would delay most awards for months or years. Samuel Eliot Morison, the historian whose work would define American understanding of the Pacific War, interviewed survivors during 1945 and 46. His account, published in Light, June 1944, January 1945, the 12th volume of his Naval History series, described the Roberts' action in detail that preserved the battle for generations of naval officers and historians. According to Morrison's research, Carr's gun mount had fired more than 600 rounds during the engagement, an impossible rate that should have destroyed the weapon, and likely would have in prolonged action, but for 2 hours. Carr's meticulous maintenance and his crew's skill had kept the gun operational far beyond its design specifications. The official Navy casualty report listed Paul Henry Carr as killed in action on October 25, 1944. His mother in Checotah received the telegram on November 2nd. The words that every parent dreaded during the war years. "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, was killed in action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country." The telegram included no details of how he died or what he had done. That information would come later, in letters from surviving crew members and eventually from Commander Copeland himself, who made it his mission to contact the families of every man lost. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland was promoted to commander and received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration, for his leadership during the battle. His citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service." Commander Copeland's brilliant seamanship and his inspiring leadership were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. He would later say that the medal belonged not to him, but to the 413 men who served aboard the Roberts, particularly the 90 who had not returned. The surviving crew members dispersed across the Pacific Fleet. Some received immediate reassignment to new ships. The Navy needed experienced sailors as the war intensified. Others, particularly the wounded, returned to the United States for medical treatment and rehabilitation. Burton spent 6 months at the Naval Hospital in San Diego while his fractured ribs healed and physical therapy helped restore his lung function. He would eventually return to active duty aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic, having requested transfer to any theater other than the Pacific, where colored shell splashes still haunted his dreams. The Roberts received numerous uni citations, including the Presidential Uni Citation, the highest award a Navy ship can receive. The formal award process moved with the characteristic slowness of military bureaucracy. But by January 1945, recommendations for individual decorations began flowing through the chain of command. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, now commanding the destroyer escort training program in San Diego, spent his evenings writing detailed accounts of individual acts of valor aboard the Roberts. He wrote about Chief Bolliner maintaining steam pressure while water flooded the engine room, about Lieutenant Roberts keeping his gun firing despite flames consuming the forward superstructure, about dozens of ordinary sailors performing extraordinary acts. He wrote 7 pages about Paul Henry Carr. The Navy Cross recommendation for Carr went up through channels in February 1945. The citation described his actions in clinical military prose for extraordinary heroism while serving as gun captain of a 5-inch gun mount aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts during action against major units of the Japanese fleet off Samar Island, Philippine Islands, on October 25, 1944. When his gun mount received a direct hit, killing or wounding the entire gun crew, Gunner's May 3rd class Carr, despite suffering mortal wounds, continued to load and fire his gun, refusing to abandon his post even when ordered to do so by his commanding officer. The words were accurate, but somehow inadequate to capture the reality of a man holding his intestines while working a gun mechanism. The recommendation encountered resistance in the Bureau of Naval Personnel. Some officers questioned whether a gunner continuing to fire after receiving orders to abandon ship deserved recognition or censure for disobeying direct orders. Others argued that while Carr's actions were admirable, the Navy Cross should be reserved for actions that achieved decisive tactical results. The debate revealed the fundamental tension in military awards. Should they recognize objective results or subjective courage? Eventually, the recommendation was downgraded to the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest decoration for valor, still a significant recognition, but not the Navy Cross that Copeland believed Carr deserved. In Checotah, Oklahoma, Carr's mother, Goldie Carr, received the medal on her son's behalf in a ceremony at the local high school. In June 1945, the school gymnasium filled with townspeople who had watched Paul grow from a boy who built model ships to a man who served real ones. The Navy sent a commander from the nearest base to present the award and read the citation. Goldie Carr accepted the star-shaped medal with its blue and white ribbon, her hands trembling as she held the small velvet box that contained all the physical evidence the government could provide that her son had mattered. She had received his last letter, written 3 weeks before the battle, in which he had complained about the heat and talked about what he would do after the war. He had wanted to become a mechanical engineer, his fascination with how things worked translating into a career plan that would never materialize. Across the Pacific, the war continued its bloody progression toward Japan itself. The battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that Japanese resistance would only intensify as American forces approached the home islands. Destroyer escorts like the Roberts continued their unglamorous but essential work of convoy protection and amphibious support. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender, many veterans of Samar experienced complex emotions. Relief that the war had ended without the predicted invasion of Japan, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Guilt that they had survived when so many had not. Anger that the sacrifices had been necessary at all. The surviving crew members of the Roberts gathered for their first reunion. In October 1946, exactly 2 years after the battle, they met in San Francisco. 37 men from various corners of the country converging to remember their ship and their shipmates. Commander Copeland attended, no longer in uniform, having resigned his commission to return to civilian life. The men spent 3 days drinking, telling stories, and confronting shared trauma that wives and families could never fully understand. They established a fund to erect a memorial in Checotah, Oklahoma, to honor Paul Carr, the shipmate who had come to symbolize the Roberts' final battle. William Burton attended that first reunion, traveling from Duluth with his wife, whom he had married 3 months after returning from the Pacific. He found that talking with other survivors helped in ways that therapy sessions with Navy psychiatrists had not. These men understood instinctively what he meant when he described the sound of shells incoming, the sensation of the deck tilting beneath his feet, the particular quality of fear mixed with determination that had defined those 2 hours off Samar. They did not need explanations or context. They had been there. The memorial dedication in Chekoda occurred in May 1947. The granite monument, funded by donations from Roberts survivors and townspeople, stood in the town square. It featured a bronze plaque with Carr's name, dates, and a simple inscription. He remained at his battle station, severely wounded and under heavy enemy fire, continuing to serve his gun until death. Goldie Carr unveiled the memorial with Commander Copeland beside her. Several hundred people attended, more than the town's population of 3,000, as people drove from Oklahoma City and Tulsa to honor. The ceremony included speeches from the mayor, a state senator, and Copeland, who had prepared detailed remarks but abandoned them when he reached the podium. Instead, he spoke extemporaneously about Carr's competence, his dedication to maintaining his gun mount, his calm demeanor under the worst imaginable circumstances. Paul Carr died doing his duty, Copeland said, but more than that, he died doing work he had made himself excellent at performing. He was a good sailor and a good man, and that combination is the foundation upon which navies are built. The Roberts herself remained at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, resting in approximately 1,900 fathoms of water off Samar Island. The wreck would remain undiscovered for decades. Too deep for the diving technology of the immediate post-war era, she lay alongside the destroyers USS Hull and USS Johnston, the 3 ships having made their last charge together. The wrecks formed an underwater memorial to the battle off Samar, steel monuments in the darkness where no human eyes would see them for generations. The immediate post-war years saw the battle off Samar, largely overshadowed by more famous engagements like Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. The public consciousness fixed on carrier battles and decisive strategic victories, not desperate defensive actions by small ships. The Roberts and her sister ships had won a victory through sacrifice, stopping an enemy fleet that should have destroyed them. But that narrative proved harder to celebrate than stories of American technological superiority and overwhelming force. The nation wanted tales of dominance, not survival through sheer determination. Samuel Eliot Morrison's historical account, published in 1958, began shifting that perception. Morrison granted access to both American and captured Japanese records, reconstructed the battle with unprecedented detail. His analysis demonstrated how close Admiral Kurita had come to destroying Taffy 3 and potentially disrupting the entire Philippine invasion. The historian argued that the destroyer and destroyer escort attacks, particularly by ships like the Roberts, had created confusion and delay that proved decisive. Morrison wrote, in no engagement of its entire history, has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0730 and 0930 off Samar. The publication brought renewed attention to the battle and its participants. Several survivors published memoirs during the 1960s and 70s. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagen, who had been a young ensign aboard the Roberts, wrote 10 Titans in 1963, describing life aboard a destroyer escort and the chaos of surface combat. His book included extensive passages about Carr's final actions, based on eyewitness accounts from survivors of Gunmount II. Hagen's prose brought emotional depth to the clinical language of after-action reports. Paul Carr demonstrated what the Navy's values truly mean, which stripped the peacetime ceremony. Honor, courage, and commitment were not abstractions to be recited at change-of-command ceremonies. They were choices made in moments of extreme duress by ordinary men performing extraordinary duty. The Navy began to more fully recognize the Samar action during the 1970s, partly influenced by the Vietnam War's impact on American military culture. The willingness to question authority and examine the human costs of warfare created space for stories like the Roberts, where valor existed alongside tragedy. The Navy named a new guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts in 1986, ensuring the name would continue serving the fleet. At her commissioning ceremony in Newport, Rhode Island, surviving crew members from the original Roberts attended as honored guests. Only 11 remained alive by then, men in their 60s who had been teenagers during the battle. They toured the new ship, marveling at technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. Guided missiles, computers, gas turbine engines that could propel the 5,000-ton vessel at 28 knots without the coal, smoke, and steam that had defined their service. Commander Copeland, 80 years old and in declining health, gave brief remarks at the commissioning. A ship is steel and equipment, he said. his voice weakened by age, but still carrying command authority. But a crew gives her life and purpose. The first Roberts had a crew that honored her name through courage under impossible circumstances. I trust this new Roberts will carry that tradition forward. He died 8 months later, having spent 43 years ensuring the story of his ship and crew remained part of the Navy's institutional memory. The documentary explored a question that had intrigued historians for decades. Why had Admiral Kurita withdrawn when he possessed overwhelming superiority? Analysis of Japanese records revealed that the destroyer and destroyer escort attacks had convinced Kurita he faced a much larger force. The Roberts torpedo hit on the cruiser Chikai, combined with air attacks and other destroyer torpedo runs, created the impression of a coordinated defense by fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, not the desperate improvisation by escort carriers and tin cans that actually occurred. Fear, confusion, and the psychological impact of seeing his ships damaged and sunk by supposedly inferior forces had broken Kurita's will to continue the attack. The tiny ships had won through creating doubt in their opponent's mind. Veterans organizations worked during the 1990s to ensure the battle remained in public consciousness. The Tinkan Sailors, a national association of destroyer and destroyer escort veterans, made the battle off Samar central to their mission of preserving naval history. They collected oral histories, donated artifacts to museums, and advocated for recognition of participants. Their efforts led to several crew members receiving upgrades to their original decorations, including posthumous Navy crosses for commanders of the destroyers Johnston and Hull, whose aggressive attacks had been as suicidal and decisive as the Roberts charge. In 2002, deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the Titanic, announced plans to search for the wreck of the Roberts. His team would use advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles, capable of reaching the extreme depths where the ship likely rested. The announcement generated significant media attention, with surviving crew members expressing mixed feelings about disturbing what they considered a war grave. The expedition ultimately failed to locate the wreck due to the vast search area and the difficulty of distinguishing small destroyer escorts from other debris on the seafloor. But the attempt itself demonstrated continued interest in the battle. The wreck of the USS Samuel B. Roberts remained undiscovered until June 22, 2022, when explorer Victor Vesovo located her resting at a depth of 22,835 feet, deeper than any previously discovered shipwreck. Vescovo's submersible captured video footage showing the Roberts remarkably intact despite 78 years underwater. The gun mounts remained visible, including gun mount to where Paul Carr had made his final stand. The discovery generated international news coverage, bringing the battle off Samar back into public consciousness for a generation that knew World War II only through history books and elderly grandparents' stories. The discovery footage showed battle damage clearly visible on the hull. The holes torn by Japanese shells, the collapsed superstructure, the broken keel that marked where the ship had fractured as she sank. Marine archaeologists analyzing the imagery noted that the Roberts had landed upright on the seafloor, as though even in death she maintained military bearing. The video triggered emotional responses from the families of crew members, many of whom had never fully understood where or how their fathers or grandfathers had served and died. The abstract concept of lost at sea gained physical reality through images of the steel tomb, resting in perpetual darkness. By 2022, only one crew member from the Roberts remained alive, Dudley Moylan, the ship's steward, who had turned 100 years old that April. Moylan, interviewed via video conference from his assisted living facility in Florida, watched the wreck footage with tears streaming down his face. "I could still see her the way she was that morning," he said, his voice wavering but clear. "She was beautiful, and she was ours, and we knew we were going to die, but we did our jobs anyway." Paul Carr did his job right up until he couldn't anymore. That's what I want people to remember. We all did our jobs. The Navy held a memorial service at Pearl Harbor in October 2022, marking the 78th anniversary of the battle. The ceremony included a moment of silence for the 90 crew members lost, followed by a traditional Navy bell ringing, 3 bells for each man, the sound carrying across the harbor, where the Pacific War had begun with another surprise attack 81 years earlier. The circular symmetry of history pleased no one, but it provided context for understanding why the Roberts crew fought as they did. They remembered Pearl Harbor, remembered the early defeats and retreats, and were determined that this time, on this day, in these waters, they would stand regardless of cost. The question of Paul Carr's decoration resurfaced periodically through the decades. In 2015, A group of naval officers and historians petitioned the Navy to upgrade Carr's Silver Star to the Navy Cross, arguing that the 70-year passage of time allowed for more objective evaluation of his actions. The petition included endorsements from 3 living Medal of Honor recipients who argued that Carr's valor met or exceeded the standards for the nation's highest military decorations. The Navy reviewed the request, but ultimately declined to upgrade the award, citing regulations that discouraged modifying decorations decades after the original decision unless new information came to light. The Silver Star remained Carr's official recognition, though many who studied his actions believed he deserved more. The memorial in Checotah, Oklahoma, underwent renovation in 2010, funded by donations from Robert's survivors' descendants and naval history enthusiasts. The original granite monument was cleaned and repaired, and the town added an interpretive center featuring artifacts from the ship, a flag, portions of a life jacket, photographs, and personal effects donated by crew members' families. The center became an unexpected tourist destination, drawing several thousand visitors annually who wanted to understand what happened. When a destroyer escort charged battleships, school groups visited regularly, and the town incorporated the memorial into local history curriculum, ensuring that Paul Carr's story remained part of the community's identity. The broader legacy of the Battle off Samar influenced naval doctrine and training in ways that would have surprised the men who fought it. The battle demonstrated that determination and aggressive action could overcome material disadvantage, a lesson the Navy incorporated into surface warfare training. Modern destroyer commanders study the battle to understand decision-making under extreme pressure, the importance of aggressive action even against superior forces, and the psychological factors that influence enemy behavior. The Roberts charging Yamato became a case study in asymmetric warfare, relevant to an era when American ships might face larger adversaries in contested waters. William Burton lived until 2008, reaching the age of 82 despite the fractured ribs that had plagued him throughout his life, becoming arthritic as he aged. He attended every Roberts reunion from 1946 until 2006, when declining health made travel impossible. Burton's children convinced him to record oral history interviews with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, ensuring his memories would be preserved. In those interviews, conducted over several sessions in 2005, Burton spoke about his shipmates with the comfortable affection of men who had shared extreme experience. He described Carr as the kind of guy who just knew how things worked, mechanical things, and could fix anything. But more than that, he cared about doing his job right. That's what killed him. He couldn't let go of his gun because he'd spent years making sure it worked perfectly, and he couldn't accept that it was time to stop. The final Roberts reunion occurred in October 2016 in San Diego, where 3 survivors attended. The youngest was 91, the eldest 95. They sat in wheelchairs at a hotel conference room decorated with photographs and ship memorabilia, surrounded by descendants who numbered in the hundreds. The survivors told familiar stories about their ship and shipmates. The tales, polished by 72 years of retelling, but still carrying emotional power. They talked about Paul Carr refusing to leave his gun, about Commander Copeland charging battleships without hesitation, about ordinary men doing extraordinary things because duty demanded it. When asked if they considered themselves heroes, all 3 rejected the label. "We were just sailors doing our jobs," one said. "The heroes are the ones who didn't come home." The story of the Samuel B. Roberts and Paul Henry Carr endures because it represents something essential about human nature under duress. When overwhelmed by forces that should have destroyed them, 413 men chose to fight rather than surrender or flee. They made that choice knowing the likely outcome, accepting death as preferable to failure in duty. 90 men died implementing that choice, including a gunner from Oklahoma who served his weapon until his body literally could not continue. Their sacrifice bought time measured in minutes, but those minutes proved decisive in saving thousands of lives and securing a crucial American victory. The battle off Samar demonstrated that the outcome of military engagements depends not solely on firepower and technology, but on human factors, courage, determination, training, and leadership. The Yamato possessed overwhelming material superiority over the Roberts, yet the destroyer escort wounded the Japanese fleet and contributed to its withdrawal. That paradox, that small ships crewed by determined men could defeat larger vessels commanded by confused or intimidated officers, has resonated through subsequent decades of naval history and remains relevant in an era of precision weapons and network-centric warfare. Paul Henry Carr rests somewhere in the wreckage of Gunmao II, 78 years and 22,000 feet beneath the Philippine Sea's surface. His gun mount remains where he last served it, frozen in darkness and pressure that would crush any unprotected human instantly. The gun that he refused to abandon, that he served while dying, rests silently on the seafloor, its barrel pointed eternally toward an enemy that no longer exists. The steel that Carr had maintained so meticulously has corroded in the salt water, the mechanism seized by rust and time, but the memory of what he did with that weapon remains undimmed by the decades that separate his final battle from the present day. His story endures as long as people remember that courage exists, that duty matters, and that ordinary individuals can achieve extraordinary things when tested by circumstances that demand nothing less.